Doing just fine. Today is Tuesday after Labor Day, so it feels like Monday, which I believe makes this the 6th of September in 1994. And I'm speaking with Mr. Hugh Peeler at the Athens Regional Library. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Peeler, P-E-E-L-E-R, just like potato peeler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peeler. I'm sorry for that. Mr. Peeler, would you tell me something of your experiences during the era of World War II?
Well, let me start off by saying that I volunteered for the Air Force, and they gave me the infantry, which I didn't like, but I had to live with it. And I went down to Camp Blandon, Florida, and there to Camp Shelby, and from there to Fort Ord, California, and finally got to be first sergeant of the outfit. That's the 43rd Infantry Division, 169th Infantry, 2nd Battalion Headquarters. And we went overseas on the USS Coolidge. And we were supposed to go to Guadalcanal, and we dropped off at New Hebrides and hit a mine. And we had to then go ashore, and we was delayed about 2 weeks going to Guadalcanal. And finally they got us to Guadalcanal, and we went up on the Unholy Four, the same ones that the 1st and 3rd Marine Division went in there. And the Japs, these submarines, they followed us all day and all afternoon, and surfers trying to draw escort destroyers off so they could get to the troop transports. And this did not work, but that night the dive bombers and torpedo planes came in and tried to sink us, but we finally made it to the beach the next day. And we went in to relieve the 1st Marine Division, who had Henderson Field at that time, and they'd have it one day and the Japanese would have it the next day. But finally we ran them back up in the hills and took over the island. And from there I went on to Russell Islands. We invaded that, and we made the beachhead there, and we had outposts, and we take 30 men out in a platoon to go out to the outpost and looking for movement of Japanese naval vessels, and we would be relieved every 10 days. And I remember one experience that we was going back, 2 Japanese fighters came down the strait, strafing their boat. We all jumped over the side and swam ashore. It was quite an experience. But then from there we went on to Rendezvous Island, and we was unloading the LSTs and LSCIs, and 16 Japanese big bombers came over and blasted us on the beach. And then we went from there to New Georgia Island, and that's where I was wounded, and was sent back to Guadalcanal to get some shrapnel out of me, and came back, and we had 2 LSTs bringing the wounded back that had got out of the hospital, and one was sunk by a Jap sub, and we lost 75 men on that trip back. So finally we took over New Georgia, and one of the funniest experiences I had, a field telephone rang one day, and he says, I want to speak to Peeler. And I said, this is he talking. He said, do you know who this is? I said, yes, my brother, because I had a letter from home that he had been in the Navy. And this guy said, no. I said, I'm the chief of police, Snooks Hardy from Athens, Georgia. I got a warrant for your arrest. I said, come get me. And he was in the Navy Sea base, and we got together and enjoyed a visit there. And there was a lot of Athens boys in that organization.
And that was on Guadalcanal?
No, that was in Rendezvous Island, New Georgia Island. We'd taken that and cleared up there. We'd gone up the slot, what we call the Solemn Island Group. And then we bypassed Truk up there, which was the biggest naval base that the Japanese had in the South Pacific. And they sent us back to Guadalcanal, and with the 1st and 3rd Marine Division for a rest. And then we went to New Guinea. And from New Guinea we went on up to Leyte and Luzon. And in Luzon is where I got my deck commission as ordered a 2nd lieutenant in the field of battle. And which I wasn't proud of it. I wanted to come home, but it's just one of those things. And so then I went on there from on into Japan and for occupation, and finally got back to the States here about 6 years later.
It's a long time.
Yeah. I got the Distinguished Service Cross and Battlefield Commission, 2 Purple Hearts and a couple of Bronze Stars, which they're not worth anything, but it's just one of those things that you had a job to do and you did it.
Well, I have a sense that you're making a long story short in a lot of ways. And I'd like you to feel free to expand upon any of that. Can you tell me how you heard of the Pearl Harbor event in December 7th of 1941?
Yes, sir. I was at the University of Georgia here, and I was dating a girl from Highlands, North Carolina. We were sitting in the car at the dormitory and with the radio on when they announced that Pearl Harbor had been hit. And I loved the girl, and I thought she loved me too. She wanted to get married, and I wouldn't marry her because I didn't know would I get back or not. So she got tired of waiting. When I got back, she was already married. But I just didn't want to take a chance. You never know how you come back. So I've seen too many of them with no legs and no arms, no eyes. You just never know. You didn't want to be a burden to anybody. And I was in active duty for 6 years and 14 years in the reserves, and finally retired after as lieutenant colonel in the Reserve Corps.
Well, can you remember some other notable events, like when they took back the Philippines and Manila Bay and that sort of?
Well, I remember one big battle that we had. It was at Clarke Field there. The Japanese had captured a lot of American equipment and they had it in the caves up there. And they had it on railroad tracks, and they pulled that gun out and fired and pulled it back in. We could never find it. So battalion commander told me, he says, take your company up there and knock that gun out. And I said, I don't want to take the whole company. I think one platoon can do it. So we took off and went up there. It took us 2 days to get up to where that gun was, where we thought it was. And we sat there and time it. It had to come out on a certain hour and fire. So we waited for him, and we had bazookas. When he came out to fire the last time, we let him have 5 rounds of bazooka, and we knocked him out. And that secured Clarke Field. And then they finally repaired and brought the Air Force in and things like that. And in one instance there in Sisson, we was trying to hold 170,000 Japanese troops up at Baguio in north, to keep them from getting down to Manila while we took that. And my division and battalion was supposed to stop them. So we bivouacked at a crossroads one night. And we was tired and sleepy and hungry and everything. And all of a sudden, a couple hours after it got dark, we heard these horses coming down the road, hobnail shoes on the troops. And they took a break right there at the crossroad. And when they did, all hell broke loose. We killed 1,600 Japanese that night, and we lost 54 men ourselves. I think that was one of the turning points of the war. We held those troops back. But the Japanese never would surrender. But we tried to talk them into it and they out of these caves and everything, but they would not. So you'd have to put a flamethrower in there, and when they come out, of course, you shot them. But very few that you ever took prisoners.
Can you recall basic training for me? Where were you sent?
Camp Blend in Florida. And I was with the 43rd Infantry Division, which was a National Guard outfit called up for 1 year duty. Of course, the war broke out. I was the only Southern boy in this battalion down there. We fought the Civil War every night. But I never did tell them there was a Peeler that fired the last shot in the Civil War because it'll lynch me. But they was a bunch of nice fellows. I still correspond with quite a few of them now. And my old Sergeant Major, he turned 80 years old September the 1st, and he called me long distance, wanted to know if I was 85 yet. But it was quite an experience of being in an organization like that. But before it was over with, 90% of it was Southerners by the war ended, because it's just one of those things that replacements and rotation and things that finally did. But my problem is I never did get to come home with that rotation business, because I got in a position where I had to stay and a lot of people had more points than I did. So they was on active duty, some of the officers, before I ever got to be one. But it was quite an experience.
Let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about your youth. Can you tell me what you studied at the university? And
Ag engineering.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. And I just wouldn't cut out to be. I was a farmer to start with. When I come over to Georgia, I thought that was the thing to do, but I saw right then I didn't particularly like ag engineering, so I just took general courses. Then the war came along, and I volunteered for the Air Force, wound up with the infantry, and that was a real disappointment. I didn't want to be drafted, but I'm glad it worked out that way. There's a certain group of people that's in the infantry that's big brother. They look after one another.
Where was the draft board in Athens in those days?
At the time, it was on North Lumpkin Street. Ms. Helen Pope was in charge of it. Of course, I got my draft notice in 1944. I'd already been overseas 2 years. And I got a big kick at it, delivered it to me on the foxhole, and I said, I got to go to the draft board. Everybody said, draft board? I said, yeah, I just got been drafted, and everybody got a big kick out of it. But that was the way things were.
Can you tell me where you grew up and whether you had brothers or sisters?
I had 2 brothers and 1 sister. They're all dead now except me. I'm the last one. And I had 1 son that's in California. I always wanted him to follow my footsteps, but he didn't. And my grandfather's brother was in the Confederate Army, and Hugh Peeler, which I've been trying to get some information on him for the last 4 or 5 years. And it was real interesting to know that we all came from a bunch of fighters. And I've gone back as far as the Revolution, but I hadn't pinned anything right down to it. But I was born up here in Jackson County in 1921, and we moved to Athens in 1936. And I went to university in 1939. And then after that, I came back and went to work for Bridges Funeral Home and went to the embalming school, and I'm owner of Bridges Funeral Home at the present time.
So you've been involved with that business for the last 50 years?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Must have seen quite a bit of change. Was that the original location of the business?
No, sir. That Bridges Funeral Home used to be down on Georgia Street there next to the Christian Church, and we moved out there in 1971 on the Atlanta Highway.
May I ask how you got into the business?
Well, it's a long story. My mother told me when we lived on the farm, chicken would die, I'd always have a funeral for it. I guess that's the way it started. And the more I thought about it, and I started pursuing it. And Mr. Bridges was real nice to me, and he got me started, and that's what happened.
Well, where did you live in Athens when you moved here in 1936?
In 1936 on Barber Street. Mm-hmm.
And what did the town look like in those days?
Well, back in those days, they had streetcars and everything else. It was quite a town, and all the farmers brought their cotton down on Broad Street and sold it down there. And it had a variety store called Warren J. Smith that once you got your money for your cotton, you go in there and buy seeds for your garden and medicine to take care of your children, and half soles for your father, put on shoes and things like that back in the Depression days. Everybody was kind of poor and it was rough. But everybody made it because all you had to do is get out there and work and grow your own stuff and feed. So it was quite an experience. And the young generation today don't believe that you had cornbread and syrup to eat a lot of times, but you did. And you raised your own cows and you raised your own pigs and everything. But it was quite an experience.
Was that kind of an in-town neighborhood to have livestock? And
oh, yeah.
Did everyone have livestock in their yard?
Yeah. Well, we lived up in Jackson County. We had all that stuff. We moved to the city. Of course, you couldn't have that kind of stuff.
I understand. Where was your place in Jackson County?
On Jefferson River Road, about 8 miles from here.
Know it well.
Have a nice river out there. Used to be some big fish in that river. Papa used to take us fishing down there and catch those great big old blue cats, and boy, couldn't beat the fish fry with those things.
Well, Mr. Peeler, let's go back to the World War II era, and if you could tell me about the ships or the bases you saw. Can you describe them for me?
Well, I was at Guadalcanal when the USS Cruise Atlanta was sunk, and I'll explain this to you. The Japanese was coming down the slot, and what I mean by a slot, it was from Tulagi Island. There's 24 miles of water between the two islands. And once you get hemmed up between there, who got into that thing was in trouble. And we was holding the Japanese up in Guadalcanal in the hills. And we got an order about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Japanese was coming down with a reinforcement to reinforce Guadalcanal. And they said, don't worry about the enemy in front of you. You're going to have to worry about the enemy coming in your rear. And so we turned our guns around and dug foxholes and trenches and everything else to try to cover it if they did make a beachhead and start up there to get those troops that we had pinned in the hill out. And just as they got dark, the Japanese fleet came through down there and they started bombing the beach in Guadalcanal. Well, our fleet was hiding behind Tulagi. And when it did, the USS Cruiser Atlanta, several other destroyers and everything was running up and down shooting at the Japanese, and they started turning their guns on them, and they were sinking their own ships. And they lost about 60,000 people that night at sea and on the beach. But they did make initial beachheads. Only about 500 got ashore. But they committed suicide that night. But we was ready for them, and of course, if they had re-landed there, they probably would have run us off the island, because we was far stretched our supply line and everything else, and you just couldn't support a troop like that. But it was quite a deal that night when you laying up in a foxhole and seeing red shells, blue shells coming, white shells coming. You didn't know whether one had your name on it or what, but they were just sinking each other down there. But we lost about 3 ships. They lost 4 transports and 5 cruisers and 2 destroyers that night, if my memory's right. They took a hell of a beating there, but they beat themselves. And there was a Marine, and the poor fellow's in a nursing home now named Joe Smith too, lived down at Carver, Georgia. He was the 1st Marine Division. He mounted a machine gun on Tulagi on Guadalcanal there at the riverhead just was off the coast. He killed 605 Japanese as they come ashore that night. He and another machine gunner. And he was quite a character, but he's in a nursing home down at Augusta.
I understand. Can you tell me what some of your first impressions of that Pacific geography?
Well, it was hot over there. It was rainy. You was in the jungles, and you'd pull down rain. You'd be dry in 5 minutes when it quit. And you lay in holes at night. The mosquitoes would wear the dickens out of you. The Japanese was crawling all around you like a snake. And if you call somebody by the name of Bill, a Jap would holler, hey Bill in English. And if you said, over here, he just threw a grenade over there in your hole. They had all kinds of tricks. They was a master at camouflage. You could go on a patrol, and the man in the rear would have to look behind him all the time, because they'd just flip up a little hole there and shoot the man in the back and pull that thing down. You never would find them. And they was in the trees. They was everywhere. And there was people said they couldn't see. They was a dead shot. And they had a lot of good snipers. And they was a master at camouflage. And you couldn't hardly find them. I know one of the experiences we had in Guadalcanal there, our hand grenades was painted yellow. And we throw one, they pick it up, throw it back. We painted them green, they couldn't find them. We did all right. But just some of the mistakes that we didn't know what was going on. And the first weapon I had was an 03 rifle that was used in World War I. That's how behind schedule we were, all weapons and everything else. And it was just an unfortunate situation that Roosevelt asked for for money to fortify Midway Island and Wake Island, things like that, and Congress didn't give it to him. And if it had, I think it'd have been a different ballgame to start with. I don't think we'd ever fought Japan if we'd been fortified and ready for it. In my opinion, we made a big mistake of putting all our ships together at Pearl Harbor. Just set it up like in a bowling alley. You just don't do things like that. But nobody thought we was going to go to war. But I think we learned a lot. I don't think we'll make those mistakes again.
Can you describe for me some of the food you were eating in different places?
Yeah, sea rations. He come in 6 flavors. Beef stew and macaroni and spaghetti, and that was about the 2 best ones we had. And of course, I seen the day that I'd give $50 for a can of that beef stew, but when you got hungry, you get hungry. But then they come out with new rations, what we call the Jungle Rations. It had some fruit bars and things like that, cigarettes and candy and cocoa and dried fruit, stuff like that, which was real better. But the sea rations that we was using at the beginning of World War II was left over from World War I. And we called them the biscuit bummers when they tried to supply it to us. They just put up a C-54 and push it out the door. And then when it hit the ground, cans was everywhere. But that's the only way they could get food to us sometimes. They had to do the best they could. And when New Guinea there, we was asking for some shoes. Our boots were wore out. And I wore size 9.5 D. And I never did find that size 9.5 D. And they told me they dropped out 100 pairs, and they'd just push them out on an airplane, drop them, and they'd go. But we started killing Japanese 2 or 3 days later, and they had American boots. So then they'd have sea rations and they'd have packs and things like that. But they was getting most of it because we couldn't find it. It's hitting in an open space out there, and you couldn't go get it. Japanese was shooting at you, and when you did get out there, you couldn't get it all, and they'd come up at night and get it. But we found out when they was getting hungry over there in New Guinea, that we'd eat sea ration and throw the can down the hill, and after it got dark, we hear them down there scratching around the can. We just pull a pin or a grenade and drop it down there. Next morning, you see 4 or 5 Japs there. That was mean, wasn't it? But war is war. Yeah, war is war.
Can you tell me what you thought of some of the commanders? For instance, MacArthur and Nimitz and Halsey.
General MacArthur was a good officer. The only thing that I didn't like about him, that he said, "I shall return." He forgot about that 500 million men that went before him. But he was taking all the glory and all the credit. "I shall return." But it made the Filipinos, the guerrillas and things like that, cooperate and fight more for the Americans than they would anything else. And Halsey, he was a great commander. And I think that Eichenberger was a real excellent division commander.
What was his name?
Eichenberger. He was 8th Army commander over there. He was great. But MacArthur had some great officers with him. That strategy and the things that worked. Until there was no other way that we could ever win in the South Pacific without leapfrogging up islands. You just surround them and cut them off, starve them to death. That was the only way you could win. And I was reading some papers here not too long ago. They found some Japanese that had surrendered 5 or 6 years ago in New Guinea there. They'd been living off the vegetation of the land now. And it's remarkable how they did. They didn't believe the war was over. But there was people that believed in the emperor, and they sacrificed their lives for him. Then another experience we had that they didn't want to surrender. And you try to be nice to them, and they were scared of you. They'd been told you'd kill them. And we wouldn't, that type of people. If they wanted to surrender, we'd take them prisoners. And but they really treated our prisoners rough, especially at Tabanto when I went in the Philippines. My company was supposed to get them out of Tabanto One prison camp there. And the Filipinos went with us. And when we did liberate them there, and the boys that was PW, they didn't trust the Filipinos either, because if one of them would escape, the Filipinos would set them out for a bag of rice to capture them. They were that type of people. And I have seen some of these guerrilla fighters over there eliminate some of their own people that sold out to the enemy. I mean, just kill them right there in front of you. That's the way that I guess that you might say is justice in the world. Because if you're trying to fight an enemy in guerrilla warfare, and one of them is a turncoat and sell you out, you don't have no other choice to let him pay the price when it's over with. And that happened quite often. And the Americans that was liberated the Banner to one, they didn't trust the Filipinos. They watched them just like it was a snake. And they was all sick. They was starving and everything. The Japanese treated them, I guess, about as worse as any country in the whole world. They just didn't believe in one thing. They'd beat them, work them, and starve them to death. But, you know, the old saying, you turn your cheek and go ahead. That's what we've done. Japan come out smelling like a rose out of this war. And I'm naming a few other countries that did. And then I'd be riding along with the boy said, that's one you missed over there. I said, oh no, he came along after I left.
What'd you think of FDR in those years?
Beg pardon?
What'd you think of Roosevelt in those years?
He was a great president. He got to be elected to President of the United States when this country was coming out of depression, was still in depression, and got us out of depression. And the only way he could do it was to build up the armed forces. And it started with the CC camps, which eventually turned out to be what we needed for military later on. And you had military officers in there running the CC camp with discipline. You'd making $21 a month when I went in the Army as a private. And the boys in CC camp was making $30 a month, and they send $25 home and keep $5 in themselves. But Roosevelt brought this country to its feet. But as I said before, that if he'd have went ahead and fortified those islands over in Japan, I think it'd have been a different ballgame. I don't think we'd ever went to war, but I think it was coming regardless of what we did. So Germany was going to involve the whole world, and they did before it was over with. And I think if we hadn't had the atomic bomb, we would have lost 1 million men on the beaches of Japan. Because when I went into Japan as occupation troops, they little bitty boys going to school marching in the military manner. They was all military minded. And they didn't trust nobody. And you couldn't even give them a piece of candy. They wouldn't take nothing from you. And you try to be friends to them. That's what we was told to do. Don't be an enemy all your life with them. Try to make friends with them. But the kids didn't trust you. None of them. But I still say my division was supposed to make the initial landing in southern Japan, and they told us what to expect. And we had occupation money of Japan in our pockets when the war was over. We were ready to go. November the 1st, 45. We'd been training for that. And I think that we would have lost 1 million men on the beaches of Japan if we hadn't had the A-bomb. And I don't regret it dropping it. So that we could save 1 million men, Americans especially, I'd say drop it. And I think Harry S. Truman was right when he did so.
There is a blue Toyota Camry in the parking lot with its lights on. The car has an Olympic license tag. Thank you.
That's not mine.
Mine neither, thankfully. I'm very grateful. It's the first time I've heard that specific voice. Did you hear of the dropping of those 2 bombs on Japan at the time?
Yes, sir.
Can you recall what you all thought at that time?
We was in Luzon Island. We was in the jungles and training to Japan when they dropped the first one. And it came over on a little 500 radio and said what had happened. And we didn't think too much about it until they dropped the second one. And then we knew something was up big because they said they just didn't know how many people they had killed there. And then our orders came down to saddle up and come back to bivouac area. And that's when we got back. I think everybody knew where we were going except us. So when I got back there in the battalion, they was boxing things up right quick. And the next thing I knew, we was in Manila and waiting for C-54s to fly us up there. And the division was coming up on ships later on. But it It was real fast. By the time they signed on the USS Missouri, we was landing in Japan, 85 miles north of Tokyo. So it was quite an experience. But I didn't have the chance to see much of Japan because my mission when I got there was to go to these armies and collect all weapons and give them a receipt for it, and that was it. But sometimes they would cooperate, and sometimes they were kind of rough with you. But the interpreter, he'd tell them, he's going to blow your brains out if you don't do this and that, and then they'd head it over. But you had to count for everything. You gave them a receipt for everything.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to all that stuff, I have no idea. I've often wondered.
Must have been a lot of arms.
It sure was. They had them.
How long were you stationed there?
I was stationed in Japan 3.5 months. And then they put me on a boat and brought me home. And on the way back, we sit up on deck, and I was reading a book called Forever Ammo. I never will forget it. And somebody said, look. And we ran over to the side and looked, and there was a mine floating out there. And I said to myself, good God, you live through a war, and on your way home, you get blowed up. But we tried to hit it with an M1 rifle. We never could hit the spikes to set it off. So they finally radioed the Navy and told them where it was at and pinpointed it so the Navy could get out there and sink it. Because we didn't have anything on this troop transport except just infantry and M1 rifles and stuff like that coming home. But that was quite a scare. Especially when you go to bed at night, you didn't know where you're going to get up the next morning. But evidently it must have broke away somewhere and it's been floating, all that thing.
Of course, once you saw that one, you must have thought you could hit another.
That's right, yeah. There was some more out there somewhere. But I hope nobody hit it. We never did know. Of course, a lot of things happened we didn't find out about no way.
What port would you have landed at that time?
Going home.
On the West Coast?
San Francisco.
And how were you released from the Army? How did you travel home to Athens?
They came through at San Francisco. We went to Camp Stoneman, and they processed us there and put us on troop trains, moving us all over the country. And I caught one there coming out of Camp Stoneman at one morning at 8 o'clock, and it was 4 days later when I pulled into Atlanta at 2 a.m. in the morning.
In a train?
On a troop train.
Troop train.
Mm-hmm.
So you were probably leaving Atlanta for Athens. Did you sell it all?
No, not at all, because I couldn't get out. When I got to Atlanta, I had to stay there 2 days for the process it. And of course, I called my parents and told them I was there, and they came over, and we spoke, but I had to go right back in because they want to talk to you and make you realize what you had been through, what you expect on the outside, and to try to talk you into staying in, just taking the leave. But I didn't do that. I said, no, I want to get out. And he said, well, you don't want to throw your commission away since you got it the hard way. He says, why don't you join the reserves? I said, well, hell, anything to get out of this man's arm. And I just held him my right hand. The next thing I know, 2 years later, I was getting orders to go to Korea.
Really?
Yeah, but that did pan out when I got to Fort McPherson. Said you had combat experience and send you back home to command a reserve unit here. But they would not call individuals, they would call the unit together if you had to go back. So that was it. That was very fortunate.
So they actually did call the reserves at that point. Would that have been 1950? Or
yeah, 1950.
Were the reserves ever called again during your time?
Not in my time, but it's been called since then.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Desert Storm, places like that, they call it a post office unity, I think. Mm-hmm.
About right. Was that Fort McPherson that you were at in 1945 or 6?
I was there in 1946 at Fort Mac. I was there in 1942 at Fort Mac.
Thank you. So when you decided to leave the Army, can you describe where you moved back to in Athens and how you...
I went back to my parents' home, and then I got married and got out on my own.
And how did you meet your wife? And
I married her father. That's the way I met her.
I understand. What was her maiden name?
And Cash.
Did you have children?
We have one boy.
Of course.
He's in California.
Where did you live as a young married couple?
On Holman Avenue. I saved my money in the service and we bought us a home.
Did you set right out into studying the funeral home business?
Yes,
And
I had been, beg pardon?
you described your education in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Where was that school?
School, well, there was one in Nashville, Tennessee, and now they have one in Atlanta.
And how long did that?
12 months.
Did you live in Atlanta during those 12 months?
Went backwards and forth.
So you actually commuted,
He
from
commuted,
Athens? Was there a train, or did you have to
No,
ride
drive a car.
Must have been a long trip.
Yep.
But you had a family here.
Yep.
And were you having to work as well?
Oh, yeah. Weekends and nights and things like that. It was quite an experience, but it's worth it.
Has that business changed in the 50
Quite a
years?
bit, quite a bit. It sure
Can you
has.
give me an idea of those changes?
Well, it's years ago, back in the 30s and early 40s and early 50s, the people die, you did most of the embalming at home. And that's changed, you do it all at the funeral home. You used to take the body home or at the funeral home or something like that, but now you just leave it at the funeral home. And you didn't have graveside service as much as you do now. People want the easiest, simplest way out, which is a graveside service. And a lot of people, of course, is going to cremation. And it's just been a tremendous change. And you got to change with time, you really have. So it's, I think what has happened more and all in the funeral business, that the problem is that these big corporations are buying up the individual, like the chain, and this is really putting a lot of pressure on people who's independent like myself.
When did you take over the Bridges funeral?
1967.
And you have not retired?
No, sir.
You are still,
I'll still
I
be
have
there.
reached you there.
Still be there.
Trying to ask another question about that. Is there anything that stands out that you can tell me from those times? Any story that would be relevant or good to?
I'd rather not put that.
Right.
I'd rather just keep that to myself. There's quite a few interesting stories.
If we could come back to talk about them sometime, that would be great. Let me take you back to the World War II era. Were there songs or movies or books beside Forever Amber? Are there things you remember from that era?
Well, of course, the Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree and the Chattanooga Choo Choo and things like that. But some of those things is past and you don't think about them anymore. What you're trying to do, and I'm trying to do, is trying to forget more than anything else. And I think that's the best way you're going to have to live with yourself. I was reading a story the other day about the boy that dropped the H-bomb. He had a heck of a time sleeping at night, because when you wipe out 50, 60,000 people with just one bomb, and I knew it has an effect on him, because the first Jap I killed, I couldn't sleep. But when the second coming at me, I didn't worry about it anymore. That's the first one.
What sort of rifles and military ammunition?
Well, we had back in those days the old 03 rifle left over from World War I. Then we had the carbine, which was a semi-automatic weapon, which is a great in the jungles. And of course, if you was lucky enough, you had a 45 just to sleep in the foxhole with you. If somebody jumped in there with you at night, and that's what they did a lot of time, and a machete and a trench knife. Those things was the most important thing you could have. But one of the funniest things that we had experienced, we had at Guadalcanal, they sent shotguns over there, and buckshot. And with all the dampness in the shotgun shells got wet, they were no good. So they eliminated that. They wanted you to use them in the pill boxes. Crawl up there and just blast them in the face with it. But it was a good idea, but it just didn't have the right ammo for it. But they started using Thompson machine gun and carbines and things like that, automatic weapon, because that's all you had was firepower over there. Because the Japanese, they was a master at camouflage. You couldn't kill them with one bullet. You just had to spray the bush they was in or the tree. So the automatic weapons were the best. And the carbine was the best weapon I ever used. It was light, weighed 20 pounds, and you could get through the jungles with it and everything else. It was just ideal. I forgot who invented that fellow by the name of Williams, but it was a lifesaver for the American troops in the Pacific, and I think they used it quite often in European theater too. I noticed that on some films I had seen. But I know what, it was a great weapon.
Did you have medical corpsmen as well?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, your medics over there, they carried weapons too in the South Pacific. The Japanese, they didn't care who they killed. You didn't call nobody a lieutenant, you didn't call nobody a sergeant, everybody was Mac or Joe. Because the Japanese, that's all they wanted was kill the leaders, and they think they would be disorganized. And one day we sent our chief out to string some wire. Pretty nice fella. And they called him Sergeant Gorman. That night the Japs crawled up on our perimeter. They called Sergeant Gorman all night long, but he never did let them know he was there. But they were just that way. Then they got where they'd holler, hey Mac, hey Joe, stuff like that, but we knew what they was up to. And you could be sitting next to a general and not even know it. He had no insignia on him or nothing. The only time you could tell he was a general, he had on a clean uniform. The rest of us were dirty. But you knew, and General Kruger was the man I'm referring to. And he said on my foxhole and said, hey soldier, where are you from? I said, Georgia. He said, well, I was stationed at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, down in Macon, Georgia. And didn't even know who I was talking to. He walked on, somebody said, you know who the heck that was? And he said, that's a 3-star general, General Kruger, 6th Army Commander. I didn't know that. But I could tell there was something wrong because there was quite a few people standing around him with weapons, you know. But he had a little 45 on him, but he was a real nice fella. And it was good to see somebody like that up there once in a while. And it boost your morale. And I was very fond of him after that. In fact, I think that was the only 3-star general I ever talked to in my life.
I understand. You've mentioned there were other fellows from the South increasingly as the war went on. Were there any fellows you particularly remember?
Well, there's quite a few of them from North Carolina. There's quite a few of them from Louisiana, some from Mississippi. It seemed like to me as the longer we was over there, we began to get more people from the South because we could stand the climate better and things like that. I don't know whether that was true or not, but we just finally weaned what we call the National Guard boys. They came home or something, and whatever happened, they transferred them out. They tried to make a complete new division out of this. And I think at the time the war was over, I think it was 80% Southern boys in it. But most of them brought in on rotation. But when you lose a dozen men in a day, there was always 2 dozen to come up and take his place. And a lot of the people that threw in there hadn't even had basic training, just 4 or 5 weeks, and they was right over there. Hadn't even fired a weapon. And we run across this, and we wouldn't take them. We'd make them go back to the rear and set up a training program down there where they could at least learn how to fire a weapon. I had one kid that come up and said he was a replacement, about 19 years old. He says, I'm going to be here long. I said, how you say that? He said, I'm going to get the Congressional Medal of Honor and go back to Washington and tie it around my neck. But at that time, the Japs let 2 or 3 rounds come over, and he was laying in the hole there shaking. I told the boys, I said, put a tag on him and get him out of here. I said, he ain't going to be no good for us. He's scared to death. But he had the idea of getting the Congressional Medal of Honor and going home. But he was just a young kid, wouldn't even wet behind the ears. But there's a lot of them like that.
Can I interrupt for just one moment?
Yep.
Jennifer, do you need me for anything? Okay. Let me ask you a question I tend to ask last, though I don't have to stop this at all. We can go on. So the experiences and the history you've been telling me about, what do you think is the most important? What do you think is the most important thing that people remember?
I think the most important thing that they remember is Pearl Harbor. I think they'll always remember that. I think that most people go to Hawaii. I don't think they would not have the opportunity, would not pass it up to have the opportunity to go to the Arizona. And I think that'll always be that way. The thing that worries me about America that we just don't have respect for the flag, and it's disturbing. And I think maybe with some things, some of the laws in this country, like pledge allegiance to the flag at school and things like that, I think that'll be our right step. But I just can't stand to see him spit on the flag or burn it. And we go to a football game and a man can't stand up and put his hand over his heart and sing the Star Spangled Banner. He don't need to be there. I love this country. And I love my flag.
Was there anything you were particularly afraid of in those years?
Well, yes. Anybody that say that they never was scared in combat is crazy. And when I left, I was scared when I got there, and I was scared when I left. But I didn't. After the war, I still didn't trust them. And when I got on the ship, then I said to myself, I hope I don't ever see this country again, or its people. And I thought about that a lot of times. That was a foolish thing to me to say, because you got to live with each other sooner or later, and it's true right here in Athens. There's a lot of Japanese, Vietnamese, etc. But you still, when you see them, you still got that feeling. I don't know. I can't describe it. I guess when you saw what they done to other people over there, and to our boys too, it makes you wonder. And then you wonder about God. Why did God let something like this go on? But you're not supposed to question his work either. But there's a lot of questions that's unanswered.
You mentioned that your brothers and sisters have died.
All
You're the
gone.
last one left.
Yeah.
Can you tell me anything about their lives and careers?
Well, my brother was a pharmacy. He ran a drugstore here for years and years. He died 4 years ago.
What was that drugstore?
Lyons Pharmacy. We had Lyons Apartments over on Olympic Street. And his motto was, a neighbor to 1,000 pretty girls, which was sorority people over there. And of course, my sister, she lived in Atlanta, and she was with a telephone company for a number of years, and she lost her first husband, and she remarried, and she passed away too. So I have several cousins on the Peeler side, but that's about as far as they go.
Where did they live?
All over. Some in Atlanta, some of them Maryland, some in California, some in Florida, just all over.
And your father, you never quite told me, those were tough times. Was he a farmer in Jackson County?
Yeah, farmer, carpenter, anything.
Was he doing carpentry when he moved to Athens?
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What sort of sites was he?
Well, he got with the University of Georgia, had built some of those buildings over there, Dawson Hall and some of those others over there.
And your mother, can you recall her for me?
Oh, yes, she was born in Jackson County also. My father was what they call a part-time baseball player on Saturday. He'd have these mill leagues around there, and he'd go pitch for them. And if you win, you got $25. If you lost, you got $10. But they called him a spitball pitcher. That was back when you could buy this Rosman and stuff. What they used then is put it on the ball, and the ball will hop going down, just like some of these ball players now. They've got these floaters, they call them. I don't know what that all meant back in those days. But my mother was a hard-working lady, and she held the family together. And
what was her maiden name?
Her name was Margaret Sanders.
Thank you very much.
And my father's name was Clovis.
I want to get that in because this is a local history and genealogy collection. As I say, this will be sitting there on reserve. Is there anything that I haven't covered that you would like to enter into this record, either about World War II or about your life and career?
No. When you get my age, you're just sitting down waiting to die.
Well, I don't buy that for a minute. And I've been lucky to reach you at work, and I know that you're still working hard. Anything else you can tell me about Athens upon your return from World War II?
Well, I had noticed when I got back from World War II, they had taken up the streetcar.
Mm-hmm.
I did notice that because the last time I was I rode a motorcycle with a friend of mine. We were going up Prince Avenue, and it had been raining, and where the old fire station was, they had the back wheel looked like it wouldn't get in front of the front wheel, so I told them just let me off, I'd walk back. But I guess that was my experience with the trolley cars. But I did notice that going down Prince Avenue, and I got home, all the streetcar tracks was taken up, because I'm sure it went into the war effort. I did notice that. And I noticed one thing when I got back too, everybody that didn't have new automobiles. And it was a strange thing, and I wanted a car so bad, and I went to one place and put a deposit down, and I waited 6 months, no car, and everybody else was getting them. So I went to another place and talked to this gentleman that was in World War II, and he said, Hugh says, I'll get you a car in 2 weeks. And so in a week's time, he said, it may not be your color, but I'll get you a car. He said, why do you want a car? I said, hell, man, I walked all over the South Pacific. I want to ride a while.
Of course, it sounds like you rode down to Atlanta quite often.
Yeah.
Was that your own car?
Yeah, that's my own car. Troutman Wilson and Darrell Wood Watson was running the University Chevrolet place at that time, and they the one that I got a car from. And of course, Darrell Wood, he was in Pentagon during World War II up there. He was in the Navy, and Troutman Wilson, he was a battalion commander, I believe, in the armored or infantry outfit. I don't know. He was in the European campaign. And he was quite a character.
Well, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Yes, I appreciate Dr. Talmadge's calling me, because I never thought about coming over here and talking about this. It's just one of the things I certainly enjoy being here and talking to you.
Well, I'm very grateful, and very grateful that you shared a little bit with us, and I hope to see you again. In fact, I'm going to have to ask for your signature at some point
Okay.
on that permission to